Welcome to Epstein Becker Green's webinar, Wearables in Clinical Trials, Navigating the Uncertainty, the second installment of our Wearables Crash Course webinar series. We are pleased to have Epstein Becker Green's Daniel Gottlieb, Associate in the Healthcare and Life Sciences Practice, presenting today's webinar. Before we begin today's presentation, please be informed that today's webinar is being recorded and that participant phone lines will be placed on mute throughout the program. You are also welcome to submit questions directly to Dan following the webinar, and contact information will again be displayed at the end of the presentation. In approximately 2 to 3 business days following the webinar, Epstein Becker Green will communicate the availability of the webinar recording and access to the PowerPoint materials. At this time, I'd like to turn the webinar over to Dan.
Thank you. So I just want to start off, for those of you who may not have been on last week's call, to just provide a little background on kind of how FDA regulates wearables. Just real quickly, we can consider them to fall into one of 3 categories: regulated wearables, unregulated wearables, and those subject to enforcement discretion. The regulated wearables obviously are subject to FDA regulation. The unregulated ones are not. The ones falling in the enforcement discretion category would be wearables that may be subject to FDA regulation, but for various reasons and based on a risk-based approach, FDA has determined that it's not going to require the manufacturer to comply with FDA requirements. So then, that's kind of the framework if we think about wearables in clinical trials. Then if we think about which type of wearable and can we use wearables from any of those categories in a clinical trial, and the answer is yes. You can use a wearable in a clinical trial, whether it's a regulated one, unregulated one, or one subject to enforcement discretion, so long as they're accurate, attributable, traceable, and verifiable. The keys to this are you really want to make sure the data that you're getting is accurate, and so if you're measuring heart rate, you want to make sure that obviously that's accurate. You want to make sure it's attributable, so you want to make sure that the data you're collecting is actually from the clinical trial subject and not from their spouse or their child. And then traceable and verifiable, again, it's just the general clinical trial data requirements that you want to make sure that nothing, the data is, what was collected is what's being reported, and it's verifiable throughout the process. So now if we think about, as we're looking at that, what should we be thinking about as you may be choosing to use a wearable? You want to think about what data are being collected, how you plan on using these data. Again, you're going to want to think about what you're going to use to collect these data. You're also going to want to think about how you're going to get the data from the wearable to the clinical trial database. And you're also going to want to think about how do I know the data that are being collected from the subject. So again, these would fall into kind of general categories, software issues, and hardware issues. So we first look at kind of the overarching general issues and some of the first questions you want to think about. What are the data being collected? Are you looking at physical measurements, whether it be heart rate or location, or is it patient-reported outcomes, so responses to certain questions that the patient's going to enter in the wearable? You want to think about how you're going to use these data. Are you using them as endpoints? Are you monitoring adverse events or monitoring the subject? Are you using them for only meta-analysis? Are they also going to be used for clinical decision-making? As you think about these, depending on which aspects of those you're going to use, the amount of validation you're going to have to do for the wearable to determine how accurate it is going to vary. So if you think about for primary endpoints, if you're thinking about heart rate or blood pressure, you really want to, obviously, that data is very important, so you want to make sure it's accurate with respect to that. If it's location, you may be able to use what we'll call self-validation. So if you're collecting multiple points of location data per minute, you can see if something's an outlier fairly quickly, because obviously you can determine if you have all of a sudden very tight location pieces, but then a point that's several thousand miles away, the odds of the individual traveling that distance in a very short period of time, you can somewhat eliminate that. But with respect to, say, if you're measuring blood pressure and you're looking at it every minute, if you have an outlier, say one outlier, is that a clinically significant outlier, or is that something with the wearable? So again, the type of data and how you're going to use it. If you're looking at adverse events or clinical decision-making, you want to understand how that data is going to get to the physician. Again, from a liability standpoint for adverse events, is it going to be passive, so the physician, PI, is going to have to look at that, or is it going to flag an alert? So again, I think those are some really key issues to be thinking about when just generally. If you are thinking about the hardware, again, you're going to want to understand whether it's a regulated device, an unregulated device, or one subject to enforcement discretion, because to some extent that is going to dictate the level of validation that's going to be necessary. So if you have a regulated device and you're using it for the clinical indication that it was cleared or approved for, obviously then really you don't have any additional validation that's going to need to be done. If you're using an unregulated device, such as a general wellness device, or you're using a Fitbit or something along those lines, you're going to obviously have to do some additional validation to demonstrate. And so FDA hasn't really provided a lot of information on how companies should be thinking about if they're going to use an unregulated device. But I think one thing that we think is fairly helpful is thinking about potentially using the guidance on research use only devices or IVDs. So in that case, you're using something that is not cleared, and depending on how you use it will depend on kind of how you have to think about it and how it's regulated by FDA. So in the column, kind of, those rows going down for customer R&D, that would be, if someone other than the manufacturer of the wearable is using that in the clinical trial. And again, if you're using it at very early stages, then you kind of want to break that down again to research with the IVD versus research on the IVD. So research with the IVD is using the IVD to collect the data. Research on the IVD, again, would be trying to use it for approval. So if you're thinking about it as wearables, if you're doing research, and you want to use the Fitbit or something to, constantly measure heart rate or movement of some sort, but that's really not using it to get approval for the Fitbit, then you would be in the research with IVD. But if you're using it to collect data to show that it's accurate for heart rate to become a cleared or approved device, then that would be research on the IVD. Again, early stage, it's basic, unapplied, and applied, that would not be subject to FDA regulation generally, but if you are researching it to generate data to support a submission, that would be something that would be FDA regulated, and also if you're using it for IVDs or supporting production control. But I think really a lot of the uses in clinical trials for wearables, if they're not used to support the clearance or approval of the wearable, are going to be something the research intended to generate data that supports a submission. And in those circumstances, you're really looking at, is the IVD not going to be regulated itself, but you'd have to demonstrate that that wearable is reliable enough for the purpose of the study and the purpose of the reason that you're collecting the data. Again, if we use the difference between location and heart rate, location would be something that you'd probably be able to self-validate because you have a lot of data points and be able to eliminate those that are outliers, whereas if you're looking at heart rate, any outliers, there's the concern, is that a clinically significant outlier, or is it something with the wearable? So again, I think it's very important to understand how you're using it, and that would dictate the level of validation you need to use before you incorporate that into the clinical trial. So then if we go back, now if we go to the software, again, things to think about are how are you going to get the data from the wearable to this clinical trial database, and how can you know that the data being collected are from the subject. And again, if you're using this to any data from an electronic source, that's used to submit and support an FDA application, you're going to be really subject to several FDA regulations. You've got 21 CFR Part 11, and so that, again, is an overarching, just general FDA requirement for electronic data, and really the keys to 21 CFR Part 11, really want to make sure the data is traceable and verifiable. There are certain, signature requirements, and so that there's an audit trail, and you understand who's entering the data, who's making any changes to the data. You also need to have a way to authenticate the data, again, to make sure that that is the person who's entering it or from whom you're collecting it is the right person. And also you want to make sure that it's readily retrievable. So that way, again, you have it. In addition to that, you're going to be subject to several good clinical practice regulations, which would include record retention requirements. So you want to make sure that the data is capable of being retained, and you also want to make sure it's accessible. And so things to think about are, what is the source data? Those are things to think about. Is it the source data of the wearable? Is it the cell phone, or is it the clinical trial database? And those things, because again, there's certain requirements of retaining and access to source data, and FDA is going to want to be able to validate and potentially monitor and look at, trace back all the way to the source data from the data that's included in the application. FDA has put out somewhat older guidances, but has issued several guidances on thinking about software issues. So again, you've got the 2007 guidance on using computerized systems in clinical investigations. Again, that talks about a lot of different issues from 21 CFR compliance and what is source data and things along those lines. You've also got, going back to that, you've got the general principles of software validation from 2002. That guidance, in addition to being helpful for the software issues, does provide some helpful information, again, for thinking about issues for validating, say, an unregulated wearable or a regulated wearable that's being used for something other than its cleared or approved indication. And then recently, FDA has issued some guidance on the use of electronic health records data in clinical investigations. So in that guidance, they were discussing the fact that while they would prefer people using certain ONC certified electronic health records, that it's acceptable to use those that aren't, but they provide guidance on privacy and security issues and some other traceability and other issues that companies should think about as they're going to collect data using electronic health records in clinical trials. So now if we think about this, and we've kind of walked through these pretty quickly, but how does it all fit together? And again, I think the keys to thinking about this is, what is the intended use of the wearable in the clinical trial? What data are you using? How are the data going to be used? And what is the source of the data? And in addition to kind of the FDA overlay of this, again, we mentioned some of the products, some other liability issues as far as if you're using it for adverse event data or clinical decision making. Those could, in addition to FDA regulatory requirements, they could bring up, just general liability issues that should be evaluated, and that's, again, why it's important to make sure the data are accurate. The other things, again, and I think they will be discussed in other in a subsequent webinar, will be some of the privacy and security issues that can come up as you're doing this. Again, it's important to, if you're collecting this data, and then, I think people are recognizing that one of the keys that subjects want when they're participating in clinical trials is, to make sure their privacy and security is maintained. So I think those are, again, some of the key things to think about as you look through this. But I think it's one of the areas that's going to be growing. I think you're seeing more and more companies do this, And so these are some of the things to think about. If there are any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. There's my contact information, and we can definitely help people walk through any of these issues. So thank you very much, and have a great day.
Thank you, Dan. This concludes today's webinar. And in approximately 2 to 3 business days following the webinar, Epstein Becker Green will communicate the availability of the recording and access to the PowerPoint materials. Thank you for attending, and have a great day.